Hello, I'm Bill Fegis, and welcome to our Business Transformation 101 podcast. In our first podcast, we stated that to ensure the business provides consistent, sustainable, improving performance, you need to deploy robust processes in all aspects of the business. We also noted that lean applies to any process and therefore is applicable across the business and should be deployed across the enterprise. For today's podcast, we have with us Mark DeLuzio. Mark is the founder and CEO of Lean Horizons Consulting. Mark and his team teach companies how to implement lean through an enterprise-wide vision to align lean activities with the organization's breakthrough imperatives and to design a culture for long-term success. Mark is the principal architect of the Danaher Business System, or DBS, which is arguably the benchmark lean enterprise in the US. Mark is also the author of Flatlined, Why Lean Transformations Fail and What to Do About It, a book that condenses Mark's 30 plus years of lean learnings from working with hundreds of companies into an indispensable guide for anyone starting a lean transformation or reinvigorating a stalled transformation. Early in my career, our leadership team had the good fortune of learning about lean from Mark and the DBS team when our company was acquired by Danaher. Our team had never heard of Danaher or lean prior to the acquisition, but we embraced the lean philosophy, and personally it formed a leadership approach that I have utilized successfully at numerous companies following my tenure at Danaher. Mark will provide his thoughts and insights on why companies fail to effectively implement a lean approach, what he has learned from studying and in some cases living those failures, and what leaders can do to avoid repeating the mistakes that could lead to doom their lean transformation. Mark, welcome to our podcast, and thanks for taking the time to provide some insight to our listeners.
Oh, thanks a lot. Good re-hooking up with you again. And I will have to tell your audience that you were one of the stellar students and implementers of DBS. As president of PacSci, you did a phenomenal job there. As a matter of fact, if you recall, we even took the analysts to your plant shortly after we acquired you because you made so many great, we took the stock analysts. I don't know how many we had there. We had quite a few.
Yeah, it was a whole, you're right. I'd forgotten about that. It was a whole analyst meeting at our facility in Wilmington, Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts. And you know, the thing about it is, you know, we would take the analysts to places that we thought were really, and we wanted to be able to show them early stage transition and how much we could really do.
Right.
With DBS, if you had the right leadership, and you were obviously the right, along with Ken and some of the other guys that were there, and ladies, you guys really embraced it and did probably one of the better jobs, I think, in all the acquisitions that we had. So,
well, I got to tell you, frankly, you know, because it came down. There were three final bidders because Danaher bought us in an auction process, and Danaher ended up winning it. And myself and the team, we all were thrilled because the other two suitors, who shall remain nameless, you know, we didn't really think we're going to provide the kind of power that Danaher did. And really what I think caught us by surprise a little is when we went and looked at Danaher, the performance, you know, through the 90s was just spectacular. And we're all looking at it going, geez, these guys obviously know something. We can probably learn a lot. And the other thing I think too is during the due diligence, Danaher took a much different approach than the other two suitors. The one suitor was kind of all over the map. The other one was all they were worried about was cost and leverage for purchasing and whatnot. But Danaher was very thoughtful and really wanted to know about strategic opportunities and where the business could be taken. And so that also was another reason we were thrilled with that.
Well, that kind of leads into your first question here, because you know, Bill, a lot of companies look at lean as a cost-cutting exercise, right? And probably those other suitors looked at it in that regard, and we did not. We looked at it as, hey, how can we properly grow the business and not only have a win for shareholders, but have a win for our employees, and also obviously our customers. So all three of those have to. I do talk about that in the book, where, you know, the lean trilogy, in the respect that, you know, we have to make sure all stakeholders win, and there are other stakeholders too, like suppliers, like the environment, like the community, But all stakeholders have to win in this game. And that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, that lean does fail, because there's only one maniacal focus on shareholders and cost. And usually cost is a result of doing all the other things right, like quality, delivery, lead time, stuff like that, right? So, so that is one of the answers to your question, that it's looked at as a short-term tactical cost-cutting tool, and that's where a lot of companies go wrong. But the other ones, as you well know very well, is the tie of our lean initiatives back to our strategic imperatives. So you were one of the better implementers of what we call policy deployment, or some I now call strategy deployment, Hoshin planning, Hoshin economy, a lot of different names for it. But you were one of the better implementers of that, and how you tied your lean initiatives back to the strategic imperatives of the company from a profitable growth perspective, and also making the conscious decision of what not to do. And that's a really hard thing for some leaders to do.
Yes, it is.
The other thing, I think, the other couple reasons is that, people focus on optimizing functions, primarily sticking with only manufacturing, and they don't look at how the whole enterprise works together. Product design, marketing, sales, accounting, finance, go down to HR. They don't look at how to optimize the enterprise. They look at optimizing usually one or two functions, whether it's engineering or manufacturing, but everybody else operates in a very traditional fashion. Because I'll always say that try to optimize and become the best function in the world, whoever it be, you will sub-optimize the enterprise. I can guarantee you that. And that's not good. And then last but not least, hands-off leadership, which basically you were not, and hands-off leadership and not sticking to some of the very fundamental basics today. Leadership has to be it's not a spectator sport, as you well know, and you demonstrated, but leadership being hands-off and not getting involved and just kind of sitting there, putting up a couple posters and saying a few things at quarterly meetings and saying how committed you are. And really what most leaders are committed in is the results. Everybody who calls me usually wants Danaher's results. They don't want to do the work involved in doing it. So that's become enamored with, and they'll say they're committed, but most do not. But hands-off leadership is a big deal, and that's something that you did not do. You participated on Kaizen events, you led, you taught, and that's the magic elixir, if you will, for success.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely right. I mean, the whole I tend to probably harp on go to Gemba too often, but it's basically, a key tenet. You got to be out there and see what's going on, be it on the factory floor or in the office. You can't do that from the conference room, as we know. So
no, exactly. And you did not do that, and again, for your listeners, if they're not familiar with the Japanese word called Gemba, it's kind of what it kind of loosely translates to is like where the work gets done, right? And a lot of people refer to the factory as the Gemba, but you could think about a truck driver. His Gemba is the highway and his cockpit that he sits in, and or a pilot sitting in a cockpit, or the operating room for a surgeon. That's his Gemba or her Gemba, and so it's where the work gets done. And going to see is a big deal, and that's what leadership has to do. See. Do you know that Toyota had and John Shook, friend John Shook, who's one of the first guys out of NUMMI to go to Japan and wrote a lot of great lean literature.
Right.
John told me that at Toyota, they do not let leaders opine on a problem unless they've observed it firsthand. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
How many meetings would you not have had if that was the case, right? Yeah. So going to Gemba is a big deal, and that's again part of the hands-on thing that I'm talking about with leadership.
Well, I thought too the Toyota practice of a new leader, a new employee, taking them out onto the factory floor, putting them in a spot, and leaving them there for the day, and just observing what's going on, and then at the end of the day, having a discussion about, so what did you see?
Well, our Japanese senseis made that. They would draw a circle and they tell me, DeLuzio-san, no talking, which is hard for me to do. And you just have, and I go back to my Yogi Berra, although I'm not a Yankee fan. Yogi Berra had a great saying. He said, you can observe a lot just by watching. Right. And so, but I met a super guy, worked for Lexus and part of Toyota, of course. And when he went to Japan, his sensei there his first 3 months had to stand in the same spot every day for 3 months.
3 months.
You know, I did it for a couple, 3 hours, right?
Right.
Every day for the first 3 months, he had to stand there. And it was interesting because he said the first thing he noticed, which was opposite of what his sensei thought, was what he heard. What he heard and then what he smelled. Okay. And then what he saw, right?
Yeah.
And the sensei says usually it happens the other way around. But when you hear things that are unusual, you know,
Right.
when you smell things, when you and obviously see things that it's so powerful just by
Right.
watching. And 3 months, he did it for 3 months.
Yeah. So great. So Mark, I mentioned the book, and great book, by the way, great read. I recommend it, highly recommend it to anybody who's either been doing lean or is thinking about leaping into it. But you talk about 5 steps in the book. Could you give a little color on that? The 5 steps?
Yeah, well, the 5 steps are kind of like the solutions, right?
Right.
To the problem that we just described. And obviously, one is, Bill, as you know, shifting the mindset. Okay, shifting your mindset totally away from traditional thinking, because you got to remember a lot of leaders, and what impressed us about you and your team, a lot of leaders got to that president's, vice president level doing some traditional things. So now you got to say to a leader, hey, what got you here now in your career isn't going to cut it going forward, right? That's a hard thing. So shifting the mindset and getting out of this whole business about we're different, because the human tendency, and there's some empirical psychological evidence out there that says that people tend to look at the differences, not the similarities, right? You know, I told a CEO of an insurance company, he said, you got to understand, Mark, we don't make cars. And I said to him, well, I'm glad you don't, because we'd all be walking. Okay. Right. And by the way, if you did figure out how to make a car, I wouldn't get in it. I wouldn't get in it. Okay. But you have to shift the mindset. Yeah, you are different. Of course you're different. And by the way, when people want to do DBS, Bill, I say, no, you can't. Okay. You're not Danaher. You got to craft your own approach, and you could benchmark. But the one thing that doesn't change, Bill, is the principles. I don't care if it's a lemonade stand or aircraft engines. It doesn't matter. The principles are the same, but you have to shift your mindset about how you see things, and what you now consider don't consider waste or abnormalities. You now have to look at them a little bit differently, right? The next one is just defaulting back to the basics. And luckily for us, and even when you started, Bill, back in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of confusion out there, right?
Right.
Yeah, we had Six Sigma kicking around. I had to fight that animal for a while, because some of the GE people that came in wanted to overtake DBS with Six Sigma. So I spent a lot of non-value added time fighting that. But you think about it now. Look what's out there. You've got a lot of confusion on LinkedIn. If you just go out there, there's TOC, theory of constraints. There's Six Sigma. There's Lean Sigma. There's demand flow technology. There's Agile. Now we've got the Factory 4.0. I don't know. I forgot. I don't know what happened to 1, 2, and 3.
But IoT, of course.
IoT, and by the way, I think IoT could be a very valuable thing in things like Jidoka, which means right, and Pokyok and all that. But anyway, there's so much confusion out there today. If we were starting today, I don't know where I'd start. I really don't. But back then we had Shingijutsu, which were the lieutenants of Tadashi Ono. They were the originators of TPS, and that's where we learned from. So defaulting to basics works. Okay. We don't need, everybody looks for a silver bullet. And part of the problem is the consulting industry that I'm in, everybody is repackaging stuff all the time with the same stuff with new names as if they invented it. And it confuses the hell out of people.
Right.
The next is aligning back to strategy. Okay. How are you going to, I could spend a lot of time 5S in my mailroom and improving my mailroom, or I can spend time on my new product development process that's going to drive profitable growth in my business, right? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't, do your mailroom, but what I am saying on a priority basis, I think I'm going to look at new product development, right? And so aligning with the strategy of the business is really key. The enterprise focus that we talked about, that you have to really, and that's where all leaders have to really be on the same page to be able to transform the enterprise. We did not set out to be, but matter of fact, I don't know if you know this or not, but we initially started out as a Danaher production system, and we changed the name to the Danaher Business System because we didn't want to become the best manufacturing company in the world.
Right.
We wanted to become the best enterprise in the world.
Right.
And by the way, Danaher, in all due respect, as good as they are, will never be as good as Toyota. They've been at it for 70 years. And Toyota is just, I think, one of the best manufacturers in the world. I studied over there. I've worked over there in Japan. I've seen their suppliers. Knock your socks off. I mean, we had one company we went to build that. The argument we had was whether or not that business was turning 300 or 700 times in inventory. I mean, that was the argument.
It's a good argument to have.
Yeah. And enterprise focus. And the last one, really, probably the most important, is this whole business about respect for people, right? Which is a bigger thing than just employees. It's respect for people and in living to the values that we talk about. So every website you go to today on a company, they'll have, all their values: honesty, integrity, teamwork, communication, blah, 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 blah. But there's no processes built to drive those values. Okay. Like I said to one client, how many people here believe that problem solving is at the lowest possible level is a core thing that we need to do? And they all raised their hand. I said, okay, do you have a problem solving process? No. Do you train your people in problem solving? No. Do you give them time to solve problems? No. Then how's it going to happen?
Right.
Okay. Do you believe the leader's number one job is to develop your people? Yeah, they all raise their hand. Do you have a career development process? No. How many people here, senior leaders? How many of you have career development plans?
Right.
Nobody, right? So right on the spot, I was giving this talk. I said, I came up with this slogan. It's a slogan about a slogan, but I said, values and principles without an underlying process are merely slogans. Yeah. That's it. Okay. And so this whole respect for people thing is a big deal. And that is probably the biggest downfall that most companies, they don't create that problem solving culture. They don't ask their employees for their input. They have them come in every day and push a green button and go home, right? And hang their brains on a hook while they're there. So that's probably the biggest deal, Bill. And then everything else kind of falls under that.
Yeah. And I think, as is always the case, people are the toughest thing to I think, achieve the right things on. Things are a lot easier to deal with than people, but you're right, the respect for people. And a lot of times you see, one of the key things I always look at for respect for people is, are you worried about and paying attention to safety and making sure everybody's safe? Because certainly if you're not doing that, you don't have a lot of respect for your people, because you've been in a lot of plants like myself, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff in a lot of plants. And, quickly you look through.
Bill, you remember at Danaher, we had the safety, quality, delivery, cost hierarchy, right?
Yep.
In that order, right?
Yes.
And the first one was safety. In a lot of respects, a lot of companies work off the mantra of cost when you really look at what you're doing. Okay. And it's not safety, quality, delivery, cost, so safety should be number one. I had a client that planned out 5 key safe hazards that they're going to work on during the year. Mm-hmm. I said, excuse me, 5? You're going to do that one in March and that one in July and that one. You already know about them? Yeah. Right. Well, why don't we do them like now? I mean, you're admittedly allowing your employees to work in that environment. Right. Well, it will be very costly if we did them all now. So I said, you're prioritizing cost over safety. SQDC, it's CCCC. And safety is somewhere way down on the bottom. So I said, that's just disrespectful if you already know that there's 5 major hazards and you're not going to deal with them until October. I said, I could just see in a defense attorney, if the guy cuts his hand off, saying, you knew about these? Right. You do it, right? That's a great example of, and that's, by the way, that's a real life example, okay, of a company who really does think about cost first, even though they talk the talk about SQDC. Yeah.
There was another on the third of the 5 items you talked about, the lean transformation with a strategy, and you made a comment in the book that I thought was a great one, because I think it went something, I'm going to paraphrase here. It's, hey, lean is really kind of an execution strategy, but you also need a business strategy to execute. So I thought it was an interesting statement, because it said, hey, lean is a strategy, but it needs to be in support of a business strategy.
Yeah, well, it does. It does. And a lot of people think that all you have to do is whack in a little lean and everything's be great. But if you have a business, yeah. And I mean, think about it. If I use the example of cement life preservers, if I can have the best lean manufacturing company in the world making cement life preservers, and guess what? I'm not going to win, right? Buggy whips, right? 8-track players.
Yes.
Although, you know what? I'll bet you any money if we put 8-track out, it would come back. I'd buy one. I used to love my 8-track player. But no, it's funny. But you're right. So I don't believe that you can just apply lean. Now let me give you an example with Toyota, okay? Which arguably is the best lean company in the world.
Right.
If you look at their return to shareholders, if that's a measure, and by the way, you could be a really great financial returns to your shareholders, be top world-class and still not be a world-class company, in my opinion, because if you're just respecting your other stakeholders like employees, customers, it doesn't matter. And by the way, I had a client like that. That was Danaher-esque in their returns, and they were not world-class, in my opinion, because they were just disrespectful to the people. I mean, really, probably one of the worst negligent leadership practices I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, but let's just look at financial returns for a minute. Since 1996, Toyota has returned roughly an average of 6% per year to shareholders, where Danaher since that time has returned over 20. Okay. Now, is Danaher a better lean company? No. But Toyota isn't a bad business.
Yes.
Automotive's a lousy business. Danaher would never, matter of fact, we sold, as I told you before, we sold our automotive supply businesses early on when I was there because we don't want to be in automotive. Okay. It's just a bad business to be in. Airlines. Why would you want to be in an airline? And so, I mean, they're worse. So as good as Toyota is, their return to shareholders is not anywhere near what Danaher is, right? And you would think it would be. But Lord help Danaher if Toyota ever got into their business, okay? Because they'd blow them away. They really would, as good as Danaher is. And I love Danaher. I love the Rails brothers and everything else. But Danaher is just not as good as Toyota. I'm sorry. But from a business perspective, they're very shrewd people. And if you look at Danaher today, all the metal banging businesses, including your business, are gone now, right? And the only business, when I left in 2001, the only business bill that they still have is Hawk, the water quality people. Okay.
Which they bought, I think, in 99 or 2000.
Yeah, about then. Yeah. Out in Colorado and also in Europe. And so they transformed that business into life sciences and medical technology and all that. And it was brilliant how they transitioned, but they used the stock as currency on the metal banging businesses like tools and Jake brakes and things like that to be able to fund that transition. Okay. So they were, now if you look at Toyota, they kind of just stuck with autos all these years. Now they have other businesses too. They do forklifts, they do Hino Motors, which was my customer, by the way, when I was running the Asian business for Jake Brake, general manager for that business. So they have other things, right, that they do, but they haven't really diversified greatly from their core. And maybe that's okay. Maybe their vision is, hey, this is okay. This is what we want to do. 6% a year, that's fine, and that's okay if they're okay with that. If their shareholders are okay with it, fine. But when you just look at that metric, they are not anywhere near as profitable as Danaher, right? So,
so that goes back to the whole point. I mean, it's really a combination of, hey, what's your business strategy, your business model? What businesses are you in? As you said, you can be in a really good business and a really bad business, but then you layer on top of that, are you doing a good lean job or not a good lean job? Ideally, you want to be in a really good business from a financial returns point of view, and then applying lean on top of that.
Exactly. Yeah, but the thing is, and I think you guys kind of did that a lot because of your technical background coming out of MIT, you smarty pants, you guys actually then, when you did Kaizen at PacSci, right? You guys were able to use your newfound capabilities to grow the business because, like for example, when you do Kaizen and you free up capacity and you shorten your lead times, you now have a competitive weapon to be able to grow, even from a new product development perspective, right? So, something that might have taken you 48 months to develop, you can do it in 12 months now. That's new math now when it comes to breakthrough against your competition. So you're able to actually use that as a weapon now. So it all feeds itself, and that's the strategic part of that, provided that you have a good business to begin with and a good strategy. When I say good business, I mean you're in a good market. And we used to look for companies that had really bad competition, right? And, even though they may have been one of them, but
So so you went through the 5 points. Another key thing I thought was interesting in the book was you talked about the lean trilogy: customers, employees, and shareholders. And this is really, I think, interesting view given the times we're in, because you're seeing a lot more about capitalism and stakeholders versus shareholders. And so can you talk a little about how you came up with the whole lean trilogy thing, and discuss a little about how you talk about it in the book?
Yeah, well, again, the trilogy really is addressing three stakeholders: employees, customers, and shareholders.
Right.
And the whole premise of the trilogy is that it cannot be a zero-sum game where only one group, like the shareholders, wins. Everybody has to win, okay? And if they all three don't win, it's not going to sustain over time. Now, so any one decision, Bill, that we make, like for example, let's say I gave my employees a raise.
Right.
Well, you can argue that's going to hurt the shareholder, right? Well, not really, because if I don't pay them appropriately, I have attrition, I have turnover, I have disruption. That's going to affect my customer, right? And when it affects my customer, that's going to affect my shareholder. So, any one decision that you make may or may not be in the best interest of the other two stakeholders, right? But as you step back maybe from 20, 30,000 feet and look over the decisions that you make over time, all your decisions need to be in concert with optimizing the objectives of all three groups. Okay, so they all have to win, and sometimes we have conflicting. The stakeholders may have conflicting objectives, right? But we have to find a way to satisfy all of that. And for example, career growth, right, for your employees. A lot of people think, hey, employees only care about making a lot of money, but as you know, money could be a dissatisfier, but it's not a satisfier long term. So, are you engaging your employees, providing them career paths of opportunity? Are you treating them fairly? That type of thing. It was funny, Bill. When I went to Honda in Marysville, I benchmarked them. They had a sign on the wall, and they were very blatant about it. It said, our priorities are: number one, employees; number two, customers; number three, shareholders. In that order. And their argument was, if I don't take care of my employees, we're not going to take care of our customers. And if I don't do that, obviously the shareholders don't get it. Right. So, and I thought, and it always stuck with me when I saw that. That was pretty cool. And so that's that's where I came with the lean trilogy, that it can't be a zero-sum game. And most companies only make decisions to try to drive shareholder value. And that's it. They cut costs. They don't think about the future. One of the things I loved about George Sherman, our CEO, was he would tell me, Mark, I'm not worried about next week, next month, next year. I'm thinking 2-3 years out. He says, I'm thinking about that and people. Those are two things he thought about all the time. And he was a walking Pareto diagram and really instilled that in me. Mark, why are you working on that? That's not priority, right? And he really instilled that in me from a strategic perspective, and always worked on the priorities of the business in regard to those bigger objectives, like 3 years out, strategic growth, and also obviously, people, right? In terms of how we're going to have the people in the saddles in 3 years that are going to be ready to run these businesses, So it was really a hell of a lesson for me.
Well, I think the other thing, I mean, you mentioned George, who was the CEO at Danaher when we got acquired, and was a fantastic guy. And I think one of the things that really stuck with me on that was a topic we were talking earlier about, going to Gemba. And I remember going on a tour at the Jake Brake plant down in Clemson, I think it was. And George is out there on the floor and he's chatting it up with all the people on the floor who he knew by first name and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Here's the CEO of what was then, a $5-6 billion company, I think at that time. And he's in the plant, he knows the operators by first name, and that kind of, gives you a pretty big impression, especially we were early on and we'd only been, acquired a few months earlier. So that was, so there was another example of a leader who walked the talk.
Well, I'll tell you, just aside for George Sherman, I'll tell you a quick story. I'm with him one time, and he walks into this plant. He and I walk into the plant, and he hadn't been there in a year. He walks up to a machine operator and says, "Hey, James, how you doing?" First of all, James is like, "Wow, you remember my name?" And then George goes on and says, "Hey, how's your daughter, Leslie, doing?"
Yeah.
Leslie, you remember my daughter? Yeah, Villanova, right? She's got to be in her, second year now, engineering, right? I mean, the guy was amazing. Okay. And he had real people skills. And, George came from the streets, and he grew up, he went through the ranks, and he had great people skills. He was probably one of the smartest guys I knew. And he also, was probably the most strategic guy I ever met in my life. I mean, I sat through so many strategy meetings with him that, I mean, I had a Harvard MBA work for me once. I took him out for a couple of those meetings, and he said to me at the end, he said, "Mark, I learned more about strategy in these 3 days than I did all of my time at Harvard." That's what he said to me. Yeah, George was phenomenal.
Yeah, he was. So.
And then you got to remember the guys who said all this, Byrne, and who wrote the foreword to my book,
right.
And George Saker, who hired me at Jake Brake. Art is a phenomenal transformation CEO. Went on after Danaher to go to Wire Mold, which is it's in Manos as well, until they got acquired by a company that screwed it up. But Art Byrne was a phenomenal lean CEO, and he agreed. Right, matter of fact, I'm going to Boston in a couple of weeks. I got to call him and see if I can have dinner with him again. But he always makes me buy. But some really unbelievable people there, Bill. And you probably didn't know Art by the time you got there, but
no, I've met Art since then, though. But it goes back to the people thing, right? It always goes back to the people.
Well, Art's one of those guys that would go out and teach operators standard work or 5S or SMED or and they'd go home and say, "The CEO taught me today."
Yeah,
he came down. He knows my name. So yeah, phenomenal. I was just
great. So if you kind of step back, Mark, and look at the book, and what are the one or two kind of key things you would want people to take away from reading the book?
Well, one of the things I'm really big on, or first of all, obviously the respect for people thing. I don't want to beat that to death, but that's so important, Bill, as you know. One of the things I always say, Bill, is you can read all this stuff, okay, but you got to go do it, right?
That's true.
Okay. So Bill, the other thing I would say is I would challenge anybody in business today, when you think about lean, right? Compare how you run your daily life to what you do in business, okay? Ask yourself the questions like, do you drive your car around the block tonight 1,000 times to get efficiency out of it? So why do you run your equipment to get efficiency out of it?
Right.
If you don't need to run it, right? Do you buy, if you live in Chicago, do you buy groceries in Los Angeles because it's cheaper? Well, then why do companies who have US-based customers go to China? Right. The math does not work. I could tell you right now, I've actually done the math. My financial background. Right. It never works. And the way CEOs calculate the cost savings are always wrong. So you think about stuff like that. You think, why do I need to do more changeovers on a piece of equipment when I got 12 products I have to make? Well, it's because your customers don't order them one at a time. They order all 12 at the same time. So you've got to do changeovers. And I'll go back to your backyard barbecue. If you're serving hot dogs and hamburgers, you never just make the hot dogs, because you're going to leave all the people who want hamburgers hanging there watching people eat hot dogs. So you make them both. Well, okay, that's why we have to change over and make every part every day as rapidly as we can. And there's a lot of math behind that, but that's a concept, right? So
Right.
all the things that we do in our daily lives, we don't do. I think we run a pretty lean. We don't buy 6 months worth of groceries because they're on sale, but we do in business. And then the design changes, and we have to scrap all the material. So a lot of this goes back to our measures in lean accounting, which I was lucky enough to be known now as the father of lean accounting back in 1989 at Jake Break. And all those traditional accounting measures drove the wrong behaviors, absorption accounting and all that. So with that all being said, I look at this and I say, we don't run our lives the same way we run our businesses.
Right.
And if we just thought about that for a minute and say, would I do this? Would I buy 6 months worth of whatever in my daily life? No, for all the obvious reasons why, right? So just think about that. And if you can just reconcile that, you would be much better off, and your business would be much better off. But you got to get rid of the measures and the compensation system that are tied to these ridiculous measures, otherwise it's not going to change.
Makes sense. So, well, Mark, once again, thank you for taking the time to join our podcast. We appreciate your insights. And if people want to learn more about Mark and Lean Horizons, you can go to the Lean Horizons website at www.leanhorizons.com. Mark's book, which I highly recommend, Flatlined, can be found on Amazon.com in hardcover, paperback, or Kindle format. In the interest of continuous improvement, I invite feedback from our listeners. Please share your thoughts and ideas on these weekly podcasts, and feel free to suggest topics which you believe would provide useful information for you and our listeners. Mark, once again, thanks. Appreciate it.
Bill, good catching up with you again, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us on today's podcast, and please join us next week when we discuss pull systems.